If there's one thing we can all identify about Lex Luthor, it's that he's bald. But he wasn't always. In fact, he used to have a full head of hair. So what happened? Where did his hair go? And where did mine go? Welcome to Comic Misconceptions, I'm Scott, and Lex Luthor has always been a comic character that I've just been fascinated with. I love the dynamic he adds to Superman comics, and even the recent Justice League comics as well. But here's a question: why is Lex Luthor bald? I know that probably sounds a bit strange to ask, but there are actually some fun reasons behind why this happened. Lex Luthor made his first comic book appearance in Action Comics number 23, where he is shown as a powerful man with an incredible gift of hypnotic influence. He's doing a classic villain plot to pit the world against each other in a global war so that he can rise up as the leader once the dust settles. But you might notice here that he looks a lot different than how we know him today, especially in his cranial region. Yes, Lex Luthor had a full head of hair, when normally we know him as a completely bald guy. So what happened to Lex Luthor's luscious locks? Well, certain stories, like the Man of Steel, show Lex looking like he just has a plain old receding hairline, leading us to believe that Lex is a simple victim of male pattern baldness. But that's boring! I can't make a video about that. Thankfully, there has been a more exciting reason in comics about Lex's hair loss. It's actually probably one that you guys are probably at least a little familiar with. His hair was singed off. The first telling of this story dates back to the 60s with Adventure Comics number 271, with a feature called How Luthor Met Superboy that was also adapted into an episode of the Super Friends cartoon. In case you are unfamiliar, Superboy in this scenario is simply just a young Clark Kent, not the Superboy that you might instinctively think of, just a young Superman. In the story, Lex is a newcomer to the town of Smallville. Superboy decides to go say hi to the new kid when suddenly a kryptonite meteorite crash lands next to him out of nowhere. Lex uses a tractor to get rid of the meteorite, and a friendship is forged. As it turns out, Lex happens to be a huge Superboy fanboy. He actually has a shrine to him of all kinds of pictures and trophies from past adventures that are all neatly displayed and labeled. Things like a rock that Superboy punched or a girder that he bent once. It's all just pretty creepy, if I'm being honest. Superboy notices that there is some scientific lab equipment there as well, and he asks Lex about it. And Lex explains that he might be a farm boy now living in Smallville, but his dream is to be the greatest scientist in the world. Out of gratitude for Lex saving his life, Superboy starts tearing down the building and remodeling it into a state-of-the-art experimental laboratory. Supes even went above and beyond, equipping the lab with rare and even some unknown chemicals so Lex can get started sciencing, though he does give Lex a word of warning about messing with those unknown chemicals. But Lex isn't worried. He already has done a lot of his research on a secret project that he hopes will make him famous. Basically, he's trying to create life, quote, out of chemicals, which is kind of vague, but it looks like it works. Lex is so excited about his discovery, and he knows that it wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for Superboy. So he sets out on his next project to create a kryptonite antidote for Superboy. He chips off some pieces of the meteorite he recovered, ground them into a fine powder, mixed them into a formula, and the antidote was successfully created. But in his celebration, Lex accidentally knocks over a flask of dangerous chemicals that starts a raging fire, filling the room with toxic fumes. Lex cries out for Superboy's help to extinguish the flames, and when he arrives, Superboy uses his super breath to put out the conflagration with Lex still inside. Alas, the puff blew a bottle of acid against the container for the kryptonite antidote, destroying it. Lex had experimented on it 1,000 different ways, trying to get the antidote just right, but with it destroyed, he'll never be able to recreate it, because the fire also destroyed his life formula along with all of his notes and research. But the most noticeable effect of the fire was that the fumes made Lex's hair fall out instantaneously, and he seems just as mad about that as he is about losing all of his research and experiments. He blames Superboy's carelessness for the destruction of all of his work and the loss of his hair. Superboy apologizes and offers to help Lex recreate the life formula, but Lex just thinks Superboy is jealous of his genius and intentionally ruined everything. Lex smashes Superboy's shrine and exclaims that he will one day be more famous than Superboy and destroy him. And that basically sets Luthor and Superman's rivalry in motion. A very similar sequence of events can be seen in one of my favorite Superman comics, Birthright, specifically issue number 8, where we see Lex Luthor as the outcast of Smallville. People were scared of him for his intellect, and he could see it in their faces. But Clark was different. He was Lex's only friend, the only person that didn't look at him with an expression full of fear. Now, Lex was fascinated by extraterrestrial life and was trying to find a way to detect it and communicate with aliens that may exist or have existed. He even even built himself a rudimentary laboratory so he could work on his greatest invention, a device that would take a piece of kryptonite and use it to send a beacon across space and time to make contact with Krypton. But the kryptonite made Clark sick, and he got that look of fear in his eyes, and Lex saw this and believed that Clark was just like everyone else in town who was scared of how smart he was and was afraid of what they couldn't understand. Now, out of anger, Lex preemptively turns on his machine and briefly makes contact with Krypton before the whole thing overloads and explodes in a massive blast. He miraculously survives, but he's badly burned and all of his hair is singed off. So those are a few reasons to why Lex Luthor is bald in the comics, but we can't stop there. This is comic Misconceptions. We have to look outside the comics and into the real world to find why the writers and artists did what they did. And Lex Luthor's baldness has a fun story behind it. As I stated earlier, Lex Luthor debuted in Action Comics number 23 from early 1940, and the first time he appeared bald in a comic book was a little over a year later in Superman number 10. So what happened during that year that made the creative team decide to take his hair from him? Well, first I think it's important to understand what was happening with Superman comics at the time. The creators of Superman, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, were incredibly busy with the success of Superman. Shuster was drawing just about everything Superman related, from Action Comics to Superman's own comic, and even the newspaper strips. The workload was a bit too much for him to handle, so he hired ghost artists to draw for him. Ghost artists were pretty common in the golden age of comics. These are basically artists, or even writers sometimes, who worked on issues of comics but didn't get their name printed in the final product. Their work could range anywhere from merely assisting the main artists and writers to doing 100% of the work while the main players get all the credit. This is just the way the industry was back in the day. People weren't necessarily trying to take all the credit for someone else's work because they were evil or manipulative or anything. It's simply how the system worked sometimes. So during this time, Shuster had a few artists ghost draw Superman comics for him, and one of those artists was a man named Leo Nowak. Nowak was working on the Superman newspaper strips in a story that featured Luthor. It is reportedly in this comic strip that Nowak makes the mistake for the first time of Luthor being bald. I say reportedly because I couldn't actually find the comic strip, but that's what the source I found says. It was a short time after that Nowak would work on the Superman comic book, with his first issue being issue number 10, featuring another story with Luthor. This would mark the first comic book appearance of a bald Lex. You might be wondering how Nowak could have made this mistake. Well, we have to use a little educated guessing on this part. If you're a ghost artist and someone tells you to draw Lex Luthor, you're just kind of expected to know who that is. They likely aren't going to describe his physical appearance in the script since he's shown up several times in the comics already. If you're in that position, your best bet might be to just go back through old comics and try to find the character you're supposed to be drawing and use that as a reference. The comic book blogger Brian Cronin looked into this and believes that most likely Nowak went back to Superman number 4 to find images of Lex and ended up confusing him with one of Lex's henchmen who was bald and beat up Clark in the beginning of the issue, whereas Luthor himself in that first issue looked like his appearance with the red hair. But you can kind of see the resemblance in how the henchman looks and how Luthor was drawn in Superman number 10. For whatever reason, that change stuck, and Lex Luthor has been bald ever since. I found that pretty interesting, and I hope you guys did too. Let me know in the comments which reason for Lex being bald you like the most. The real life version with the artist's mistake, or any of the comic versions. Perhaps I even missed a comic book version of the events leading to his baldness. And if I did, let me know in the place where you let me know things. Below. Before we close out though, I want to have you all vote on a topic for a future episode. So Superman has a rich history that lends itself to having a lot of topics that I could talk about on this show, and I'm thinking about doing another Real Origins episode that's Superman themed. So would you guys like to know the real origins of Kryptonite or the real origins of Superman Part 2? We talked before about the short story that inspired the Man of Steel, but now I have found some even more cool stuff. Both episodes will be based on unpublished comics regarding their respective topics, plus some other interesting stuff thrown in there as well. But wisely, because I will be tackling the winner in a few weeks, so click on the pictures at the end of the video to cast your vote. But first, if this is your first time hanging out with us here at NerdSync, we'd love you to hit that big sexy subscribe button. We do weekly comic book videos just like this one every Wednesday, and we don't want you to miss out on any of it. Once again, I'm Scott. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram, and we'll see you right here next week for more things that you thought you knew about comics. Now, go vote.